Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeremy Benamy, president of J Street, and I am very excited to be joined this morning by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts 7, who is one of the most exciting and most significant new members of Congress in the most recent two-year session. She is a leader on issues of racial justice and police reform, which have emerged as very, very central to our nation and to our politics over the course of the last several months, as you all know. J Street, which is an organization that was founded to provide a progressive Jewish voice for Jewish Americans and other Americans who care about Middle East policy, decided in the wake of the 2016 elections that we couldn't stay silent on issues of injustice, whether it was immigration, whether it was racism, whether it is all forms of white supremacy, that these are core issues, no matter what our policy focus is, that we must speak out on and have a voice on. And that leads us to the conversation today. I want to introduce Congresswoman Pressley, and also in the process say thank you as well to Alan Solomon, who is the vice chair of our board. And I know Congresswoman is a close associate of yours and helped us put this conversation together. For those who don't know, which I doubt there are many, Congresswoman Pressley is a first-term Congresswoman from the state of Massachusetts. She worked for some time as an aide in Congress to Congressman Joe Kennedy. She worked for Senator Kerry for 13 years in a whole variety of roles, and she has been named one of the Young Democrats to Watch from 2016 by the New York Times. She is an Emily's List rising star. All of these accolades don't really, I think, begin to capture the importance of your voice and your role in this moment. And I know that you're going to be telling us a little bit about your legislative priorities and a little bit about your perspective on this moment in American politics and what we can all be doing to further the cause of not only police reform, but really of justice in the United States. So Congresswoman Pressley, a real honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's great to be with all of you in virtual community today. While we cannot, in the interest of the public health, be together physically, it's very fortifying to join you in virtual community. And it's so important that we not allow our dialogue and our partnership to wane. It's more important now than ever, not only in the midst of this pandemic, but at this moment of national reckoning when it comes to racial justice. And we are managing a crisis within a crisis. It would seem racism is the only thing that COVID-19 didn't bring to a halt in our lives. J Street, you've been a partner to me over the years in dismantling systems of oppression, confronting hatred in all its forms. I'm really encouraged that you were intentional about inviting me to engage in this timely dialogue. These are conversations that we have offline. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be in virtual community and to do something more public facing, and that work will certainly continue beyond this webinar today. Again, thank you, Jeremy, for that warm welcome. Thank you to my dear and longtime friend, J Street National Board Member Alan Solomon as well. As I've said so many times before, our destinies and our freedoms are tied. Oppression anywhere is a threat to the liberation and the humanity of all of us. And for too long, Black and brown folks have been profiled, surveyed, lynched, choked, brutalized, and murdered at the hands of police. And we cannot allow these fatal injustices to go unchecked any longer. To be clear, the systemic racism and institutionalized oppression facing Black communities didn't just happen. It was precise, it was targeted, it was legislated. And I believe if hurt and harm can be legislated, then so too can healing and justice. So as much as my heart breaks that we have to continue to come together, to protest, to demonstrate in order for our very humanity to be seen, my heart also swells that so many of us do continue to come together as organizers, as activists and community builders, taking to the streets, demanding action, calling for tactical approaches like my bill to end qualified immunity, as well as broad and sweeping reforms like the framework laid out in my People's Justice Guarantee. and a fundamental shift in funding priorities at the local, state, and federal level. To be completely honest, being the daughter of, and my mother, Sandy Pressley, may she rest in peace and power, who was a tenants' rights organizer, a social worker, a community organizer. She made sure I knew early on that not only the beauty and the excellence and the genius of what it is to be Black, but that I was aware that I was being born into a struggle, and that the pursuit and the work of justice would be a long time pursuit. I hope that in word and deed every day I'm delivering a love letter to my activist mother, and how I show up in the world and how I create space for that work in pursuit of justice. But honestly, there can be no justice for George Floyd, for Breonna Taylor, or for the families who've been locally impacted by police brutality and the murder of their loved ones. Burrell Ramsey, Terrence Coleman. In a just world, they would still be alive. However, there must be accountability. And let me say that police violence is just one element of the systemic racism facing Black communities. We find ourselves at this national reckoning and this tipping point, a community that has been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 because of the comorbidities of structural racism, this maddening deja vu. And so in the midst of all of that loss and that trauma, to then be besieged by the most recent images and consecutive murders of unarmed Black folks, again, we find ourselves managing a crisis within a crisis. So if you believe that Black lives matter, and you believe that justice for the Black lives that we have been robbed of matters, but the unrest in the streets is not only about the demand for that justice. There's unrest in the lives of Black Americans across every issue. It is systemic, it is pervasive, and that's why there is unrest in the streets. So if you believe that Black lives matter, the work ahead is about investing in and funding Black communities. It means you also believe that Black artists matter, tackling Black student debt, that Black homeownership matters, that Black business matters, that Black data matters. Racial justice issues reach across every aspect of our society, and therefore, so too must our legislative responses. In March, I introduced a congressional resolution to condemn police brutality, racial profiling, and the excessive use of force. I introduced that resolution because congressional intent is a powerful tool. And in this moment, Congress must act as the conscience of our nation. I'm heartened to have J Street's endorsement of this resolution. And today we have 174 co-sponsors who have signed on. Revisiting again, I introduced the Ending Qualified Immunity Act with Representative Justin Amash so that police officers can finally be held accountable. Again, there can never be justice for these families because their loved ones would still be with us, but there must be accountability. And to date, that has been denied. There must be accountability when our constitutional rights are violated. Qualified immunity is a set of protections invented by the Supreme Court, expanded and strengthened in court case after court case, which has shielded police from accountability, even in the most egregious cases of murder and police brutality. I also partnered with Senator Elizabeth Warren to introduce the Andrew Kearsey Act, which would require police and correction officers to provide medical care to people in their custody and hold them if they present with a medical need, and to hold them criminally liable if they don't. Our nation's prisons and jails are petri dishes for COVID spread, and we continue to hear from incarcerated individuals as well as prison staff sounding the alarms on the continued lack of PPE, lack of testing, and the continued overcrowding that makes physical distancing impossible. That is why I've been calling on the Department of Justice and the White House to commute the sentences of those most vulnerable before it is too late. Involvement with the criminal legal system should not be a death sentence due to COVID-19. Our work doesn't end there. With Senator Kamala Harris, I've partnered with her to fight for grants for our truly small businesses, not the Shake Shacks and private equity firms, those businesses that are simply too small to fail, that are the backbones of our community. Beauty salons, barbershops, bodegas, restaurants. And in partnership with Senator Warren, I've called for the cancellation of student loan debt, securing $10,000 in cancellation for some of our lowest income borrowers in the HEROES Act, which is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. And we didn't come late to this work. Last year, I introduced the People's Justice Guarantee, which proposes a bold, transformative solution to demilitarize police forces, to redirect funding, and to increase accountability. So we must remain dedicated, consistent, and committed, and most of all, intersectional in our organizing efforts. Together, we can legislate healing and justice, but it is going to take all of us to do that. So what can we do in this moment? I look forward to us getting to that in the questions, and so I will just end there because there is so much work to be done, but I do want to get to the questions, and hopefully I can expound upon and enumerate further as to what I think this moment requires of all of us.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And J Street is a very a policy nerdy group that
Yes.
does love to get into the specifics. You know, we are tremendous supporters of folks being out in the streets and raising their voices, but we want to be the ones that help translate that voice and that power and the passion into actual change. And so understanding what the pieces are of the legislative agenda is so vital to our people. And so thank you very much for that. In that spirit, I wanted to pick up on a thread that you put out there related to the COVID epidemic, and specifically, you know, the tremendously evident disparities of how this pandemic is hitting different communities, and particularly people of color. And, you know, again, looking for legislative specifics, I'm curious in the package of legislative activity that hopefully will happen towards the end of this month. What are some of the most important pieces in your priority list that we should be looking out for, and that perhaps we could add our voice of support to try to address some of the inequitable impacts and, of course, root problems that underlie the impact of this epidemic?
Well, it's been challenging to meet the scale and the scope of this hurt. The coronavirus did not create this inequities. It's laid bare and worsened these entrenched inequities that persist throughout our country, certainly in the Commonwealth, and certainly in the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, which I represent, which has been the hardest hit district in the Commonwealth. Chelsea, you know, highest rate of infection per capita. Communities like Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester and Boston disproportionately impacted. Towns like Randolph, also in my district. And again, that has everything to do with unequal access to healthcare, which is why I continue to fight for and have secured funding for our community health centers. So I hope you would join me, you know, in that call, not only for them to have the reliable revenue in the face of this pandemic, which we are still in, but also to ensure their viability afterwards. I have 15 community health centers in the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District. 1 in 3 residents in my district receive their care from a community health center. The diversity of the staff, the cultural humility and competency, the quality of the care, and the fact that they serve our most vulnerable, our low income, our seniors, our immigrant neighbors, you know, regardless of citizenship status. Again, Black and brown communities. And so that's one investment that I think is really critical in meeting the scale and scope of this pandemic. As I said, Black data matters. And so Senator Warren and I early on introduced the Equitable Data Collection Act, and large tenets of that bill were included in previous relief packages. And what that means is that the resources, the healthcare response is focused not on population size, but where the need is the greatest, where the resources follow the most vulnerable and where we see the highest infection rates. But you need the data. Anecdotally, we knew that Black and brown communities would be hardest hit, again, because of the comorbidities of structural racism and because Black and Latinx communities dominate the essential workforces. And many of those workforces were not being provided with PPE. So there's higher rates of exposure in a community like Chelsea, multi-generational, people living in small, overcrowded apartments because of our affordable housing crisis. Chelsea being in close proximity to the airport and experiencing environmental injustices, having some of the highest asthma rates. All of these things work together. So we knew anecdotally these communities like Roxbury and Chelsea would be hardest hit, but we needed the data to support that. So now, because of our legislation, it is required, it is mandated that racial data is collected, disaggregated, and publicly reported to ensure that our public health response is one that is equitable, both when it comes to testing and treatment, contact tracing, providing mobile units, mobile field testing, and those sorts of things. And then on the economic recovery side, the two things that I lifted in my brief remarks that I just want to enumerate, or rather underscore, in terms of the economic recovery, we had to fight really hard to diversify who the lenders were. In the second round, we were able to get community development financial institutions, CDFIs, minority deposit institutions, MDIs, and that did move the needle some, but not nearly enough. What we saw again, and you see these racial inequities exacerbated in this moment and really laid to bear, is that the banks were working with those with pre-existing relationships. And so many Black-owned businesses, immigrant women-owned businesses are unbanked or underbanked. So it was first come, first served. So immediately disadvantaged. And so we wanted to do something precise, which is why Senator Kamala Harris and I introduced the Saving Our Street Act, which is a $124.5 billion micro business grant fund. We heard from our businesses, we do not want loans that we have to pay back because we fear we will not be able to. These grants go up to $250,000. They allow you to provide for payroll, healthcare, rent, utilities, or to furlough. And it's required that 75% of those grants go to historically underrepresented businesses. And then finally, the Saving Our Street Act also requires the collection of data so that we'll know where are those grants going based on race, gender, industry, geography. That which gets measured gets done. So all those things are helpful. So you could be helpful in advocating for the Saving Our Street Act wholesale or tenets of it to be included in previous relief packages. The latest projections indicate that 41% of Black businesses will be permanently shuttered. They will not reopen. And then finally, student debt cancellation. I see that as a racial justice issue. Black students borrow and default more than any other because of the impacts of redlining and Jim Crow and the original sin of slavery. Over time, these have proven barriers to our families building generational wealth. And the average borrower has about $30,000 worth of debt. There are 855,000 federal borrowers in Massachusetts. And so by canceling student debt, both for private and federal loans, that will help to jumpstart the economy and put money back in the pockets of working, struggling families. And I do see that as a racial justice issue since Black students borrow more than anyone else.
Thank you very much for that. I want to encourage folks, we've got a few minutes left. I want to encourage you to put some questions in the Q&A box if there is any particular topic that you would like to hear the Congresswoman address, primarily on these issues, but if there's anything else on your mind, feel free to put that in the Q&A box as well. I do want to raise, you mentioned intersectionality in your comments, and the Jewish community feels very deeply a commitment to fighting for justice and to the equality for all, and to ensuring that those words have meaning. That's always been a key part of who we are as a community. It motivates J Street in our work when it comes to the conflict that we deal with, but it is the motivation of the desire to stand together and to fight together here for the kinds of things you've been outlining. I wanted to get a sense from you if there's more in your view that the Jewish community could be doing to be there in this moment and to be a good partner and to be truly supportive of the type, not only the legislative agenda, but more deeply the movement that we're trying to spark in this country to find real meaningful justice?
I appreciate that question very much, Jeremy. And I think, as evidenced by the fact that you initiated this webinar and invited me to participate is just one such example of the intentionality with which we need to move, and holding space for everyone's lived experiences, and then being led in that work by those closest to the pain and most impacted by it. What I see in this moment is there's a culture shift. There's a national reckoning with a multi-racial, multi-generational movement. And it's been a sustained one. Even I think in Boston in the last 2 weeks, maybe there have been 15 additional Black Lives Matter protest marches or demonstrations. Now, why is that happening? Why is it sustained? Because we're at a tipping point. And there's a culture shift, but what there needs to be is a power shift. And that's everything about movement building. A power shift that creates that accountability internally in the halls and the governing bodies, so that we see racial justice codified in lawmaking, but also in our budgets. I don't want that part of the movement to be left out of this, because the reality is that the Black community has been historically under-resourced, under-invested in, and also divested from. And so I think those budget pushes are especially important, that we're seeing those investments on the front end. What are some tangible things? You could be partners in the census. This is, I represent one of the most undercounted districts in the country. For every person that isn't counted, we're missing out on about $20,000 of federal investment. In the state legislature, there is a bill moving around police reform that includes ending qualified immunity, which mirrors my federal legislation. Again, there can be no justice without accountability. So leaning in on those efforts. And then we know that there was already an affordable housing crisis. And so we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic telling people to stay at home, but the eviction and foreclosure moratoriums are sunsetting. We have not canceled rent or mortgages, and we are on the precipice of an eviction tsunami. So any efforts that you can support, we can talk about my work on the federal level, but I don't want us to forget about the role that our governor and our mayors play, because with the power of the pen, with their executive role, they can effectuate a lot of the change necessary to address the disproportionate hurt and harm that communities of color, and in particular, Black Americans experience, especially around wealth building. So leaning in on those fights, showing solidarity, and then being informed and led by those closest to the pain, and holding space for everyone's hurt. I think we have to have equitable outrage about the intersectional injustices and the structural oppression that persists.
Thank you for that. We have only a couple of minutes left, and I know you're probably running back to back from the Zoom to Zoom, so I won't keep you longer, but there's a few questions in the chat that relate to, on the one hand, a desire to know a little bit more on the police reform and criminal justice reform, and whether defund the police is really the best slogan, let's say, for police reform.
I have a lot to say about that. I'll go over time to talk about that. Okay, finish your question though. Go ahead.
So that's one strand that I'll just throw out there, and
Okay.
then the other is the question of anti-Semitism that does rear its head within some progressive spaces at times, including sometimes in spaces related to Black Lives Matter, and the importance of speaking out on that. And I know that you feel very strongly about that, and I just wanted to give you a moment to say something about those two.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, I think it's really important that we are demonstrating equitable outrage about the marginalization, about the othering, the oppression, about the hate crimes that occur for anyone, including anti-Semitism. I mean, we've seen, unfortunately, with the occupant of this White House, he emboldens and fans the flames of bigotry, of white supremacy, of xenophobia. And I do believe it has resulted in a loss of life. So not only are his policies cruel and draconian and discriminatory and hurtful, but the rhetoric is, and it has emboldened so many people. So we've seen a rise in white supremacy, in anti-Semitism, in the AAPI community has experienced growing hate crimes. And so what I would say is that I think there's also an effort underfoot to undermine progressive movements. And I mean that everywhere from disruptors who seek to undermine our coalition, as well as foreign interference. So I know it can be difficult to draw the distinctive difference, but we cannot allow what is a multi-racial, multi-generational movement to be undermined, to be co-opted. The mostly Black, queer, and trans organizers who founded Black Lives Matter honor the tradition of Black activists since the inception of the civil rights movement. And that is as community builders, not community destroyers. And that is the difference. When it comes to the defund movement, this is another example of efforts to co-opt and to undermine. The defund effort is not new. Dr. King said our three greatest evils are poverty, militarization, and racism. And so this movement, which has now become a national conversation, is a moment that was made possible because of the activism and the movement building for decades to demand that our communities be invested in. So I support the defund movement, but we can't allow the narrative to be co-opted because this is about investing in community. And let me just say this. First responders have a role to play in our society, Jeremy, but they don't need to play a role in every part of society. And they don't want to. Why are we deploying police to schools when students are having a conflict? If we make the investment in social emotional wellness supports, we don't need school police. We need school nurses, social workers, psychotherapists, counselors. Why are police being deployed to the home of someone with a mental health challenge or breakdown? We should be deploying mental health clinicians, right? I'll just lift those as two such examples. So I believe where our money goes is a statement of our values, and it's clear that our budgets to date have not valued Black lives. And that's why when I was on the Boston City Council, I voted down at least 3 budgets. We need to invest and refund. That's really what the movement is about. We need to invest and refund in order to create a more equitable and just society.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And it certainly was worth taking the extra couple of minutes to get your perspective on both of those things. Thank you so much. And I know there's a lot more questions in the chat. I'm sure people are very excited and motivated by the conversation. And as you said, you know, it is clearly taps into something with our community and our world where people really do want to stand together with you, to take your lead, to be supportive, because when we stand together, we'll win. And we will beat back the forces that have, that have oppressed not only the Jewish people, not only African Americans, but all communities that have faced this kind of injustice and intolerance and prejudice. And it starts in November. We've got our work cut out for us. We've got to make sure that everybody gets to vote. We've got to make sure that we have a different occupant in the White House, a different majority in the Senate, and that is what J Street is really focused on for these next 3.5 months as well.
Well, that's the problem. We don't want an occupant. We deserve a president. Exactly. And right now I feel like an American without a president.
Right.
You know, well, yeah. So I thank you again for the invitation. Let's continue to build this table, to do this work together. It is not only that as Jewish Americans, as Black Americans, that there is this shared experience of bigotry and hate and oppression. But the good news is that also we can share in a collective liberation, and a collective victory. And so I look forward to our realizing that day together. And please do continue to call on me, and I will do the same with you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, and success with all of these important efforts that you are leading.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.